right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session of Conversations on Leadership and Equity. My name is Adriana Rains. I am a LeadBoston alum and the engagement manager for YW Boston. Conversations on Leadership and Equity feature a candid conversation with a distinguished LeadBoston alum, providing us a valuable perspectives on leadership, equity, and social change. Our guests share their personal stories, talk about their work, and do some reflection on how the LeadBoston program has shaped their leadership journey. This series is an opportunity for us to connect, inspire, and empower one another to drive positive change in our communities and beyond. I'm excited to begin this journey with all of you and look forward to the engaging conversations that we will continue to have. Just a few notes, this session will be recorded. If you would like to opt out, just let me know in the chat and we will make the necessary edits. Keep your mic muted and please use the reaction emojis. We love emojis. If you lose connection, just sign right back in and sit back and relax and grab your lunch if you have it. So today we are thrilled to be in community with Koren Phillips, who is a LeadBoston alum and the Executive Director of Teaching and Education at Mass General Hospital. Koren Phillips is a total powerhouse. I'm going to start with that. She has executive oversight for the planning, execution, management of strategic initiatives related to the core educational mission of the hospital. Outside of her work, Koren dedicates her time to nonprofit causes. I told you she's a powerhouse that reflect her interest in women's leadership, addressing systemic inequities in her local community, education, and the arts. Koren is a member of Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts Board of Directors. She is on YW Boston's Advocacy Committee, the Boston Arts Academy Board of Advisors, and the Junior League of Boston. I do not know how she manages to do all that, but we're going to find out. Koren holds a BA in Spanish language and literature and an MBA from Simmons University. She lives in Jamaica Plain. That's where I grew up, one of my favorite places. And as I said, a member of the LeadBoston class of 2022. I would like now to welcome Koren, introduce herself, and then share a bit about her and your role and why you do this work. Passing it over to you.
Thanks, Adriana. This is a great introduction. It's always funny when you someone read back the bio you provided to them, which is always a little bit cognitively dissonant, but lovely. Adriana and I are LeadBoston classmates, which is how we know each other personally and then have deepened our connection professionally as she's moved into this role, trying to foster a broader and better sense of engagement amongst the YW community, which has been a terrific way to stay connected. As Adriana mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Teaching and Education at the MGH. I am, full disclosure, at this point, basically a Mass General Brigham lifer. I have spent my entire post-MBA career within the Mass General Brigham system, that since 2010, so 14 years, which is sort of hard to say out loud, but the bulk of my career was in the cancer center and cancer and oncology work, first helping to manage the relationship between Dana-Farber and the Brigham across town, then moving into a role here at the Mass General working on our cancer center network, which is to say all of the community-based oncology relationships that we had outside of the main campus here in Boston. And for the past 3.5 years, serving as the executive administrative leader of the hospital's teaching and education mission pillar. So it's been a real joy to arc a career through sort of clinical services and community outreach, and then into digging into what is all of our missions are important, but educating the next generation of caregivers in obviously an expert manner, but in an empathetic and open and, you know, diverse and competent manner is something that really resonates with me. So that's a little bit about me. Just
Yeah.
quickly too, I've lived in Boston since 2006. My parents grew up here. They're from the North Shore. I am a transnational adoptee. I'm Korean in origin, but my parents are Caucasian folks from Boston. And so that's a little bit about some of the identities that I bring into space and into community.
Wow, thank you so much. See, every time I speak with you, I learn something new about you.
I try.
You are full of surprises. Well, thank you so much, Koren, for sharing that. Can I ask you what led you to this work?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I started my post-college career. So after I graduated from the University of Chicago, I studied Spanish language and literature. I knew sort of intellectually that wasn't going to be my terminal degree, which is a level of privilege. I think that really speaks to, you know, some of my own personal background to be anchored in a place, and is also complicated because I think that there are so many jobs and opportunities that don't require graduate education. There's absolutely no reason why a bachelor's degree, for those who want to seek it, shouldn't be a terminal degree, but I could wax poetic about our addiction to higher education, of which I'm sort of both a problem and an example of that for a long time. But I worked in health insurance, so I worked for Aetna, and had actually a very good career there. I had gone through a training program where I moved to Connecticut and lived with a bunch of recent college graduates, and we entered into sort of the Aetna sales force. Essentially, I worked on large corporate clients based in Chicago, but my dad became ill. My mother had passed away my first year of college, and so my dad was ill, and we very quickly relocated to Boston. So this was 2006. What was really fascinating about that situation is that I was a recent college grad, and my management team in Chicago let me work remotely from Boston for a year while my dad was ill, essentially, and had the opportunity to be a remote employee, which like definitely didn't exist in 2006. Like that was not the vibe. So that was a really interesting thing. And then my dad passed, and I ended up getting a full-time job with Aetna here in Boston, and then left for business school. Went to business school at Simmons, which was a great experience. At that time was a women only, or a women presenting program, which was really important to me and was really special. And then ended up in healthcare. I should say hospital administration. And so what brought me here is that I don't take for granted the privilege of the both access and the sort of high-end care that my family experienced, being in the socioeconomic class and racial class that we had, in terms of feeling both comfortable and willing to partake of the medical establishment. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 7 years old, and she lived a decade with that. And that's unheard of, right? And she lived a decade because we knew how to advocate and had access to the finest care at places like Johns Hopkins and Dana-Farber. And that's why she survived as long as she did, right? Like that ovarian cancer is detected late in life, or like late in, sorry, it's disease progression, and is often almost always terminal. And so I really took that to heart, and thinking about like, how can I leverage my privilege and my expertise to perhaps bend the curve a little bit on access to care, and how patients and families access that. You know, I'll get a little nerdy for a second. Most people in my kind of world, right, they access care at academic medical centers, at specialty hospitals. Someone gets a cancer diagnosis and they are going straight for somewhere like Dana-Farber Brigham or the Mass General. That's how that goes. The overwhelming majority of cancer care in the United States takes place in the community, at community hospitals. And so I really believe that it's our responsibility, coming from these places like the MGH, where I have built a career for the past many, many years, to raise the care, raise the level of care in the communities in which we live. You know, it's very important that we are the example and the ones who are pushing that envelope, because I can't tell you how many patients and patient families I spoke to in the Merrimack Valley in southern New Hampshire who, in Maine, for whom coming to like Portland, Maine is a big trip, let alone coming into the Commonwealth or coming all the way to Boston. So I really think about that. So that's kind of what brought me into academic medicine.
Well, thank you. What a journey. Sounds quite interesting. Thank you for sharing that personal piece. I'm so sorry to hear that. Um, it always amazes me the path that lead us to where we are today, and how our personal experiences, educational experiences, how they all play a part in where we are today. And I'm interested to hear, how do you bring this, how do you advance, this access to quality level of care through the work that you do with MGH Brigham?
Yeah, great question. I think that really reinforcing that our community work isn't a secondary mission is really important in understanding that, coming to 55 Fruit Street here in Mass General, where I am located currently, is not
Yes.
always available to people, and it's not always comfortable for people. We experienced a lot of this during the pandemic. So we were all redeployed, right, in lots of different ways. I obviously have an administrative job, and so had a redeployment where we were handing out masks to, the workforce coming in, because we didn't quite know, what the transmission was and how to hand people masks or leave them on the table, when to sanitize. Like it was a whole ride. But
Yes.
the thing that was really fascinating to me, so like in your HR record, right, you can talk about or indicate what additional skills you have, right? And so my HR record says I'm fluent in Spanish, which is a true statement, right? Like I studied Spanish language and literature in college. I grew up in South Florida. I'm fluent in Spanish. So I just remember getting a call from HR and they said to me, "Hi," and I was like, "Okay, hi. I already have a redeployment job. Like, what are you bringing to me here?" And they said to me, "How fluent is your Spanish?" I was like, "What kind of question is that?" Because I would not put it in my HR record that I am fluent unless I were fluent, but which is a very funny question. So I share this because we ran out of translators. So we at Mass General typically don't serve a deep and wide Spanish speaking population. But during the pandemic, many community members who fall into that demographic category were the sickest in our community, and we were the hospital best equipped to take care of them. So the number of Spanish speaking patients we had in hospital exploded above and beyond our ability to take care of them with translation. And so we had 2 swim lanes. We had a clinical translator group. Like, I'm not a medical translator, right? Like, let's be clear. Like, right, like, I am fluent in Spanish, but I'm not a medical translator. The other thing too to know, for liability, it is not preferable to have a family member translating for a patient. Like, that is a port of last call, but that is not the preferred methodology of this. So we had a team of Spanish speakers. We had our translator team, right, who works in medical translation.
Yes.
We had a clinical team that gets redeployed for translation, and then they had this bucket of other people who spoke Spanish and who would call families and be like, "You can come get grandma now." And the humbling nature of that, though, because it's the hardest work I've ever done. And, Adriana, going back to your question around like, how do you kind of reinforce the importance of raising the levels in the community or focusing on our community? The questions that families had for me in making those calls, they weren't like, "When can I come get grandma?" They were like, "Where do I get PPE? I'm out of the house all the time. I don't have any money for food because I had an hourly job. Like, is my grandmother going to recover?" Like the social, emotional, and the sort of societal matters that came forward, and how humbling it is as sort of someone who fancies herself very community engaged, very intelligent, very kind of, aligned with this work, it was extremely humbling. And I think just reinforced the need to kind of put the burden of this leveling up of what we do in the community on organizations like the one in which I work, where we'll tell you all the time we don't have enough resources, but the honest truth is we have more resources than almost any other organization in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So I offer that. The other thing I offer to kind of as a counterpoint to this, where my conversation about my employer is that we are the largest private employer in the Commonwealth, not just Boston, in the entire Commonwealth. And we did not lay off a single employee during the pandemic.
Yes. Wow.
So
I have to hold on. I have to clap because that's unheard of.
Right. So it would, I'll talk a lot of game about making jokes about, again, the employer where I built a 14-year career, but that says a lot, I think.
Yes.
And we're still paying for that now, literally and figuratively, right?
Yes.
Like that did not do a great job on our finances. But if we had laid off the number of people in our workforce for whom we didn't really have work, right? For whatever reason, like it would have been so destructive to the Commonwealth because of the number of people we employ. So, again, that's our responsibility, right? Are we paying for it many, many years later? Yes. Is that sort of like the way of the world? Yeah, like you kind of make decisions in the immediate term and have to figure out what to do with them in the longer term. And we're sort of at that longer term juncture now. I don't think anyone regrets, as hard as it is right now in this kind of budget cycle. Our new fiscal year starts in 2 weeks. We're an October 1st fiscal year, like the federal government. No one regrets that, right? And I think that everyone believes that is our responsibility. So I look at the community mission, to come full circle back to your question. That is part of our community mission too. It's not just the patients we serve, it's the, tens of thousands, verging on hundreds of thousands of employees who work not just at the Mass General and National Brigham writ large. That is our responsibility to this community too. Yeah,
to make sure that you're taking care in-house.
Yeah,
because that means that the services that you provide, are much better because you're not short-staffed.
Right.
I am really surprised and glad to hear something like that your hospital did not, at a time when everybody was laying off, and understandably so. I'm not, saying anything against people who had to lay off, but that you and the hospital, this Mass General Brigham, decided, okay, this is clear. We are not going to add to what's already, a drastic situation that we're dealing with in the community.
Right. And we knew we didn't need patient transport people, right? We needed a quarter of the number of people, right? But we paid for 100% of them. It was the right thing to do. I think that can be an anchor for thinking about how critical we are of large organizations, and again, it's really complicated, right? Like it's really hard to unpackage these kinds of things, and the collective memory is short, right? Not a lot of people are going to remember that, right? But I think it's an important kind of point to think about. Absolutely.
And to your point also, that people don't remember these big decisions that could have impacted our communities differently.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we always look at what's a company didn't do, or that, so to hear something like that, it's really, I think for me, it really makes me proud, to be to live in Massachusetts, for this to be our state. We have a lot of work to do, but we are taking steps in the right direction. Yeah. And one thing, Koren, that you didn't mention, remember when you went through LeadBoston, your leadership commitment?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a perpetual kind of point of thought for us. So, one of the other pieces that I have kind of operationally beyond my strategic support of the education mission pillar is a really practical one where, we, as part of medical education, medical training, we have a high-end simulation center with mannequins, high fidelity mannequins that are basically like, if you've ever done CPR training, it's like a nursing Annie on steroids. So the background about nursing Annie, though, just to contextualize this and like, why is this the default? The company that makes Annie the origin is a Scandinavian like baby doll company.
Yeah.
So we know that just based on demographics, that Scandinavia, much like Asia, is very kind of monolithic in terms of the ethnic makeup of the country. And so Scandinavians are like blonde and white, like very fair white, right?
Yes.
The original Annie was modeled after the daughter of the toy company founder. So that's just to give you a bit of context around like, why these mannequins are like very, very white, but they're very, very white. So the curve is starting to bend towards increased diversity, both in the high-end platforms, but also in some of the smaller things that we use, like different models to learn how to do like lumbar puncture, so like a low back model or an IV arm, etc. So my commitment is, as Adriana has described, was to make sure that all things being equal, like all things being equal in terms of the clinical kind of appropriateness of it, the functionality, that we would always get a diverse option. So that's a big deal, right? And the other thing too is, these mannequins are really hard and expensive to manufacture. They don't love to kind of change like the assembly line, right? It's complicated, but we are a powerful entity, going back to like, how do you use your kind of like behemoth power for good? Like if we, Mass General, and then, going up a level from our organization, Mass General Brigham, are saying like, we need, okay, when we're teaching sickle cell simulation, I cannot have a Norwegian doll looking like he's wearing blackface, which is something they sent me. And I was just like, ooh, okay, well, I gotta cover this with a sheet. I never want to see this again. So these are the kinds of conversations we need to have, but now we have a much more appropriate kind of anatomically correct, mannequin of a darker melanated skin tone that accurately represents a patient population, because of straight demographics of what a sickle cell population looks like. That mannequin's super expensive. It's the most expensive mannequin I have. That's a different kind of set of issues, right? Around like, okay, they finally gotten to the point where the appearance is appropriate, but now it's the highest end technology, so it's the most expensive, right? Like there's a lot to package there too, but we're getting there. So yeah, so I love a diverse IV arm. I love a diverse lumbar puncture model. And so we're really trying to do that. We're trying to be instructive that like the default doesn't have to be fair-skinned, and particularly a fair-skinned man. We also had an issue with gender diversity. My running joke until very recently, when we purchased some female simulators, was that like we did have a singular female simulator. She was the birthing mannequin. So I used to make, as Adriana said with my introduction, I'm very interested and supportive of reproductive justice. Also, I'm for Planned Parenthood. So I used to joke that like, okay, we only have this like female mannequin who gives birth because that's all women are good for. I made that joke a lot on a regular basis. But grateful to say we do have a subset of female mannequins now who are also diverse. So
yes.
Yeah,
and I for one, every one of us here is very grateful for that. I know that back when you were working on that, we had the opportunity, our cohort, to actually see the mannequins. And it was, I mean, these are things that not everybody thinks about, like I've been doing CPR trainings, and you never think like, why are these mannequins all white? It's not something really that crosses your mind unless you are intentional.
Right.
And
that's why I also like to contextualize it a little bit with the history of the company, right? Like, I think that like that goes back to sort of like my context for like Mass General Brigham things too, right? It's not always just like nefarious intent, or it's not always just defaulting to what it's the fair skin patriarchy, right? Like there are countries that have monolithic ethnic culture, right? Like, and again I'll pick on Asia and Scandinavia. Like, this company's from Norway. That's what everyone looks like in Norway, right? Like that mannequin does reflect the population of Norway, right? Absolutely. Like that equipment is culturally competent in Norway. So, I say that to just kind of think through some of these things, which is, I think, one of the biggest pieces of labor, I think, in diversity work, right? Like, I think that especially as we've been moving towards this election and this year, like, I've really tried to, within reason, right? Because not everyone's a good actor, right? Like that, let me be
Yeah.
clear about that. Like, right. But within reason, I've tried to sort of recenter myself on some of these things and thinking through good intent, right? And trying to think about, like, okay, is there a little something that I don't know here, I don't fully understand here? Let's be real, the answer could very well be no, right? But like,
Mhm.
again, I think about this doll company example, which is now a mannequin
Yes.
company, right? And like, how does that evolution kind of not fully reflect what their intent is or what their beliefs are as a company?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I like hearing that you take that approach to it. Let's really dig in and look at the history, because this particular company in Scandinavia that actually created this, they created that with information for their population, so even when it gets here to the United States, then it's up to us to
Right,
say, okay, this is our population. How
right,
do we make the modifications and adaptations?
right.
Because we all have a responsibility instead of just blaming fingers, like, why did they just do it like
Yeah.
that? Because that's what they needed,
The thing that's hard about that though is that is labor, right? Like that is
Yeah,
real labor, that's real work.
yes,
So I think
yes,
that trying to think about like the protection elements you need for yourself in doing this complicated work are
yes.
important too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And having that balance to keep your sanity.
Yeah,
Let's give sort of the benefit of the doubt. Let's not focus on what that doesn't resolve, but how can we use whatever, it might be a quantum computer, it might be, I don't know, a new machine that Mass General Brigham has.
right.
How do we address the inequities in healthcare,
Right.
and it's a little bit each day, that we do it through our work, through our service, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you so much for sharing that. Koren, what are some key lessons that you have learned, along the way in your career?
I think that finding both I am someone, and as Adriana knows, who likes to be in community. And for me, one
Yes,
of the most important things has been to find like my little bubble. And what I mean by that is I don't mean bubble by an insular thing. I mean bubble by things that you're surrounded with. So I have been very intentional about building a network of colleagues above me, colleagues who are lateral, colleagues who are in, more junior positions or at different points in their career that might put them at a different level than I am, to figure out how to get some of the things that bring me joy outside of the workplace in the workplace. I have always been keen to think about mentoring and bringing up the next generation of whatever that is, right? Like whether that is, youth or someone who's at you see in them you from a different point in your career.
yes,
I think it's important to have a lateral place to kind of like vent and share some of those things that are complicated kind of at a point in life, either family wise or career wise or whatever. And then I think it's important to have the people who will say your name when you're not in the room, right? The people who will advocate for you. I was really fortunate to have two managers in my previous job that I still call on a regular basis
yes,
as mentors and now friends and just cheerleaders. To just give you an example, one of them, so I started teaching in a master's program at the Harvard Med School now, and my former boss is like one of the program directors there and had brought me into that. And because she knew that I'm interested in sort of diversifying what I do, and I love education and I'm thoughtful about kind of,
yes.
that piece. So that was really wonderful. And then my other former boss, I had two bosses, which is always a complicated thing, but luckily they also work really well together. So I'm grateful for that.
Okay.
Both he and his wife have been just champions for me and delightful, like
Hmm.
people to assist. They know I'm quite philanthropic. They have brought me along their own philanthropic interests, you know, through my old boss. That's how I got involved in the Boston Arts Academy.
Yes.
His wife is how I got involved with Planned Parenthood. So they have fostered both my professional journey by being advocates for that, but also my personal journey and connecting me to things that are important and compelling. We had lunch recently. Literally the only thing we talked about was the election, right? And how we structure our work, like for that, like what is our responsibility to the election, and how
Yes.
does that work? And so I'm grateful to have those folks that maybe I connected with through work, that you can
Yes.
discover. Like, I don't think you have to, like, you know, make everyone at work your best friend. I think that's complicated too, right? Like, you
Yes.
know, I do think that it's important. And again, like going back to a little bit of what I described as my identity features, Rosa, I don't think you're on the call yet. Like, I was raised by two wealthy Caucasian people, right? And so my frames of reference and my comfort in being in rooms and just saying whatever the heck I feel, like I never feel like I can't bring my whole self to the workplace, because
Yes.
my whole self is like, you know, whatever, like a bossy white man, right? Like, see my dad, right? Like, you know, I'm being a little flip, but like, yeah, I'm like, okay, like when people are like going off on that in rooms, I was like, look, I know you, you're my uncle at Christmas, like, great, whatever, like, stop talking, right? Like, so
Yes.
I do recognize that I am very comfortable in these spaces that can be more complex with people who have,
Yes.
you know, the same sort of physical identities as I do. Although, like, I can also like wax poetic about how, like, in terms of like diversity, like, I always joke, and this is like a little bit of a deep cut, like I am diverse, right, in my outward physical presentation, but like the most acceptable diversity is a fair-skinned East Asian woman, right? And so I do not take for granted also that, like, yes, I'm diverse, but on the scale of like how are people responding to this, like I am the least complicated of that response. That's not to say there aren't race-based things that are
Yes.
harmful, but I'm just saying, if we're having if we're looking at a scale, not the
Yes.
hardest place to be on the scale. So I say these things about gathering colleagues in community or feeling like I can find both friends and champions, as someone who knows and recognizes that that has been easy for me because of identities that
Mm.
I hold. So what I think about is how I can make that easier for others who might
Mhm.
share features that I have, recognizing my own privilege, but perhaps smoothing a pathway or making introductions or having conversations with people that help kind of chip away at some of those
Yes.
challenges. Or at least if they could maybe get comfortable with me, maybe they can get comfortable with someone else too.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. The importance, what you just highlighted is the importance of your network. You know, who are you surrounding yourself with? You know, who are the people that you are going to call when you are, you know, stuck somewhere, you know, and you don't know what to do? Who are the ones that you're going to call, you know, talk to when you need to vent
Right.
and to work through
Well,
something?
I'll give you this. And again, this is a lot of privilege. This is a
Yeah.
lot of sort of like, you know, again, I recognize that my own situation. So 2016, for election day, I was doing like get out the vote, like on the ground stuff in New Hampshire. Then, of course, the election went the way it did. I so happened to have a one-on-one with my boss the next day. And
Yes.
I remember just going into his office and being like, okay, like here's my list of the 1,000 things we professionally need to get through, because the work doesn't stop, right? Even though it felt like the world had, but you know, the work doesn't
Yes.
stop.
Stop. Yes.
And I just remember just sitting in his office and just like weeping. I just looked at him and I just
Yeah.
started crying. The other
Oh,
piece of this puzzle, and again, why I also offer this too, he is a Black man, right? And my
okay.
other boss is a redheaded Jewish woman. These are also people who bring complex identities into the
Yes.
workplace, right? And so just like a club of people with complex identities. And so I don't say this because I think that I don't want to say marginalized. They're like non kind of white male presenting existence lends themselves to a level of perhaps empathy and philanthropy. They're both quite philanthropic. That speaks to us. This is the other challenge too, where like in the workplace, and I struggle with this too, we sort of like want to find our own, right? Like we
Yes.
have this really bad habit, I think, of being like, you're mini me, I want to bring you along. And I don't mean mini me in like a, oh, you're so cute, just like
Yeah.
you're me 5 years ago, right? Like,
Yes.
that is something that I struggle with too. This is a conversation I have with my old boss a lot. Like, Rose, I don't think you were here for this either. I know it's being recorded. I feel like I'm really like getting on my soapbox of all of my broader topics here.
Please do.
Higher education really, really rankles me as someone who has an MBA and has been privately educated my whole life, right? Like, again, I hear it. I do hear it.
Yes.
So one of the things I struggle with is like our addiction to higher education, right? Like when I was graduating business school and I was coming into, I got a project manager job at Dana-Farber Brigham. I networked my way into that job because of the people I know. I earned that job, right? I had 12 interviews for that job, but I got my first interview because someone was someone's college roommate, right? Like that's a full disclosure, right? We have this really bad habit of saying like, you must have a bachelor's degree, you must have a master's degree. And I do this too, right? Like I was hiring a program manager on my team. Again, this isn't me 5 to 10 years ago, probably more like 10, right? Me 10 years ago. The code in our system, right, by the letter of the HR jobs was master's degree preferred, not required, right?
Yes.
Someone committed to diversity and equity, looked into the eyeballs of my HR recruiter and I said, I will not interview someone without a master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh yeah, girl, I hear it. What have you done? Like, what are you doing? And then I had this conversation with my former boss and he said, look, the fact that you think about this and are saying it out loud is progress, right? Like I personally, as a young woman, right, in the workplace, am not going to single-handedly change generations of trauma and the way we think about this.
Yes.
And I think what's difficult about this is, his supposition was, is it worse to bring someone in and then have them get treated so poorly here that you are tearing down their confidence, their opportunities? Like how much labor, how much work, how much risk tolerance do I currently have to handhold that and to bring that through the system? That's not to say that person wouldn't be fully qualified, capable of doing that job, outstanding, but we are so snobby, right? Like, Adrienne, I think you've heard me tell this story before too. We are so addicted, especially in the system where I work, right? Like, again, I went to the University of Chicago undergraduate and I went to Simmons for my MBA. My physician partner went to Princeton undergrad and he has his medical degree from the University of Virginia and he did his training at the University of Michigan. He has been here for the past 25 years, right? I have been in the system for 14 years. Yes. We are both of us viewed as second-class citizens because we did not go to Harvard.
Wow.
I do not know how to explain that to people because in certain circles, people will look at places like Princeton and the University of Chicago as even more elite than Harvard.
Yes, yes. And
yet, okay, so how do you circumvent that? For him, you get a professorship because he's a clinical person, right? And for me, you become a professor at HMS, and there is our entry point.
Yes.
I say this because I don't know how to, and I think that we just have to keep saying it out loud. In some of these constructs that are so traditional and so entrenched, I don't know how to single-handedly move towards that. And as you look at these decisions that have been made with respect to affirmative action in college admission, you're really getting all my greatest hits here. Like, I don't know how to keep fixing this. That's something that, again, my old boss's point was the fact that I say this out loud in almost every forum I'm given at least speaks it into the world, even if I don't know how to fix it. Yeah. That's the other thing that I would say. I do carry this with me a lot. I do worry about like how I think about this too. I do worry about how almost all of my best friends, we are all of us master's plus educated, right? Like, is that the demographics in which we've been brought up? What does that mean? Like, again, very complicated. But, I do think about like, the burden of getting stuck in someone's head about that. Like I think about it a lot. I don't want to stop thinking about it, but I do think that this is one of the challenges that we confront in kind of the work, right? About how do you it's Sisyphus, right? Like I'm pushing the boulder up the mountain, and I'm like, just gonna roll back down soon. But like maybe there will be other like Sisyphi at the bottom with me, like wanting to push the boulder up. But this is something that I think is really complicated. If you look at student debt, if you look at predatory student debt, if you look at this, like, you know, predatory student debt happened because we had companies who were looking to capitalize on a vulnerable population, to say that their only entry point into the middle class was to get a bachelor's degree. Yeah. We did this, like, right? Like, and so I don't know how to fix that, but that's something that I grapple with a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you. I tell you, you, Koren, we can have like hours of conversation, and we should probably think about having more conversation about this issue because as you say, you don't know how to fix it. I don't think there's any one of us that knows how to fix this. We're talking about unlearning and unlearning years and years, you know, of conditioning that, I mean, that's what you do. You have this, your whole life is planned from the moment you're born. You go to school, you go to college, you know, this is how you're going to become a productive member of society. These are the steps. And if you don't have the support, the network to be able to do that, then you're always going to be spinning your wheels in the bottom.
Right.
You
like
know.
Here's a good confession element of this, which will be kind of both funny, and it's the only thing that resonated with me from this book. Okay. Before JD Vance became full JD Vance, like I hopped on that New York Times bestseller list and I read Hillbilly Elegy too, right? Like, the thing that was, I thought, so telling about elitist shorthand, right? And how cruel we are about this was he was talking about being at a recruitment event when he was at Yale Law School, right? And I think that the waiter asked if he wanted like Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, and he had no idea what that meant, right? Because it was just wine, right? Like, it's these cultural shorthand moments, right, that I think that are the most sort of damaging, right? Like it is and I'll give you another example of this from my own background. I was a tour guide when I was at U Chicago. I loved my U Chicago experience. It was great. And for a number of reasons, right? It's all cost savings, right? Like the dining hall was closed on Saturday night. Okay. We framed this as a like, you can go out and explore the city, you can go downtown, you can try new foods, you can do this. I was like, isn't that great? And yeah, it was great for me who had my dad's credit card and was like lighting it on fire, living like, you know, hundreds of miles from home. What I subsequently learned is that there was a whole, and I'm going to call it underground because it was an underground community of students who didn't have the resources to do that, who were there on aid or had other packages, or maybe not quite aid, but not quite the freedom to be like, I'm going to go spend $25 on dinner every week. That the dining hall staff, bless them, literally, would help them ferret away food and like give them a package for the weekend because they knew in serving this elite student population what it might be like to not have access to food. Right. To know that like, even if it's just a box of cereal, or if it's some leftover pizza, something that's a little bit like can stay a little bit, right? Like that they needed to provide that. But when I would speak about that as an opportunity, like these are the kinds of things that I think we have to be thinking about dismantling and unpackaging. You don't have to apologize for the world in which you came up, right? Like I could argue, like, right, someone left me on a church doorstep when I was a couple years old, right? Like the fact that I have like landed into this life is a miracle, right? Like, so I don't think that people have to be apologetic for what their life was like, but I think that they have to be cognizant of how that sort of lack of information can be really violent to people. And I think that that's the thing that I really think about, like, right? Like it's the reason why when we have leftover lunch from meetings, I just moved into this new office, it's beautiful. But when we have leftover from meetings, there is a certain list of colleagues I email who I know the people in this institution who need to find that leftover food.
Yes.
So they can come find it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that is, and those, it might seem like a little thing to you, Koren, and you're one person doing it, but that's the key, for us when we become more aware. And I love when you said, we don't have to just to feel bad about our history or that we had a privileged life or all this. That, we're focused on here and now. How do we move forward from here? And I think you just said something so powerful that I'm going to have to process, that there's nothing wrong with having led a life, where you had privileges. We all have some in different ways, but being aware of, okay, what about the rest of the population, the others who did not have those opportunities? How do we make it better for them? How do we level the playing field in any little way we can to do that? And that is what, my last question is like, what did LeadBoston, because that's all we talked about for a whole year in LeadBoston, about all these systems, institutions, beliefs. How did the LeadBoston impact you and your work?
Well, I think what I particularly appreciate now that I'm on sort of the other side of the LeadBoston experience and do really enjoy staying engaged with the program, either through hosting a part of the healthcare day or doing interviews. The intentionality I think that the team puts together the cohort with is really remarkable, because what I think was fascinating was this like weird alphabet soup of like, here are a bunch of people who live in Eastern Massachusetts. Go, right? Like, the thing that I really take with me, in our cohort, we had people who worked in the corrections department. We had people who were police detectives. We had people who worked in like private equity, right? Like it was really the gamut of stuff.
Yes.
And so I really appreciated that. The other thing too that I thought was like really eye-opening, and Adriana, maybe you remember this, like I found I don't remember what the topic was. Maybe it was like the police and like jail. Anyway, we went to Suffolk jail.
Yes.
And then we had gone to community servings to have a visit. And they're like, oh, we're really glad we could do this. This is so important. Like this is a transformative day. And then at some point along the way, we found out that their families could not visit them. Yes. Like they were still on COVID limitations, that families could only do phone calls or iPad visits. And yet we were there, masked, distance, all the COVID-y stuff.
Yes.
There. And I just remember being in the little conference room of community servings, and I raised my hand and was like, absolutely not. Like, I think that you owed it to us to tell us that, because I would not have come.
Yes.
This is not, these are human beings. This is not looking at animals at the zoo. This is like, they don't need to see me trotting through here, observing them, being in what is their home and their space when they can't even see their loved ones.
Wow.
I think that like what LeadBoston pushed me to do is to kind of see those things too, and to know and appreciate that even those of us who are the best intentioned can sometimes fail precipitously. Right? And I think that's okay. I think sometimes we are so critical of the colleagues that we do in community with whom we do this work, and so critical of ourselves, that sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees. And I really appreciate the LeadBoston experience and the breadth of the types of people with whom we were in community that you wouldn't necessarily be with in community. I just remember, Adriana, do you remember Steven when he was talking about the election? And he's like, I have had like such serious conversation. Oh, no, it was his driver's license. Do you remember that conversation?
The driver's license, yeah.
So the kind of like, that anyone could get a driver's license. We had this colleague in the LeadBoston cohort, worked in private equity, right? Like he said, he had a lot of tough conversations with basically the private equity bros with whom he worked, to be like, no, they have to get licenses, and here's why. And we were like, there it is, right? I think that coming from a place of empathy and support for folks and trying to kind of again, appreciate or realize best intentions, right? Like they were all there. It's hard work. Like taking
Yes.
a full day and doing the pre-reads and being available. It's not a small thing. Even if you're only peripherally interested is better than doing nothing, right? Like,
Absolutely.
like that's still progress. And
Yes.
seeing the leaps and bounds on some folks
Yes.
were perhaps, obviously in the same room, but maybe at a slightly different place in the room, like move through more deeply, I think was really special. So that's kind of what LeadBoston gave me. It gave me kind of the appreciation to know that even the best people in community can make mistakes, and we have to be forgiving and think about that. But
Yes.
also to know that like just because someone isn't exactly where you are doesn't mean they aren't trying.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, everybody, you have to respect everybody's journey, and it's like a kid, when you're dealing with young ones, you don't think badly about them because they don't know what you know.
Right. Right.
As long as they are trying, doing the best they can.
And,
Karen,
and you have to be kind of gracious about that, right? Like the current
yeah,
example I'll give, I'm so delighted that reproductive health and reproductive justice is a front and center topic.
yes,
I want to scream every time they say trust women. I'm like, trust birthing people, but I'm like, middle America does not know what that means, right? Like,
no,
so like to be at Trust Women, that's great. I have to find joy in that, right? Like,
yeah,
people will not like I'm gonna be like, the reductive in this, like, right? Like the people in the Midwest who don't think about this all the time are not gonna like want to hear me like opine about how like non-binary and trans folks can also be birthing people and
yeah,
blah blah blah. Like I
yeah,
get it. I get that that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative. So like trust
yes,
women, right? That's
yeah,
good. Like don't let perfect be the enemy of good in some of this coalition work, right? Like I think that that's again what LeadBoston also sort of taught me.
yes, yes, absolutely. You have to speak people's language,
Yes.
and that's what one thing, you mentioned, and I've learned a lot in doing a lot of community work. I can't stand in front of a crowd and use scholarly words, and expect that they're gonna feel like they're connected to me. You have to know who your audience is.
Right.
Yeah, and that's perfect. Koren, I know that you have a meeting, you have a million meetings coming up. And we are so grateful that you have given us so much time. This will not be the last conversation because you are a wealth of information, a wealth of inspiration. I could say so much more. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Rosa also for being here. This session will be, it was recorded, it will be published for others to view, and we will continue to use it to to further the goals that we're aligned on bringing, equity, bringing inclusion, on doing the little bit that we can, as much as we can, everywhere we can.
Yeah.
That's what we do. We don't look back, and we're not going back. And that wasn't a political statement.
It can be. It should be.
So any last words before you take a little break before your next meeting?
No, Rosa, thanks. I'm sorry. I feel like I like lectured at you for this whole time.
Oh,
It's
no.
like
I
thank you for
love
joining.
loved a lot of this stuff. I made some comments in here. I appreciate your time, your
Yeah.
wisdom, your words. Yes.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Yeah.
Right.
So we will see each other again.
Yes, Adriana, reach out if you need anything. And Rosa, Adriana has my contact information. So if you ever have anything, feel free to reach out.
Yes,
Okay, will
please.
do. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Bye bye. Have a good day.